There's a pattern in pharmaceutical history that has destroyed every drug empire built on a single blockbuster molecule. Not most of them, every single one. And in the 1970s, one company wrote a single pill to become more profitable than most Fortune 500 companies, controlled the sedative market like a monopoly, and then collapsed so completely that the drug itself was erased from legal existence in most of the developed world. The company made billions. The drug was prescribed 2 billion times, and within 15 years, both the empire and the molecule were gone. This is the story of how one pharmaceutical company built everything on a drug called Methaqualone, how they engineered demand through doctors and marketing, how they lost control of their own creation, and why the entire system had to be dismantled. Because when you track the rise and fall, you see a 6-stage pattern that repeats every time a pharmaceutical company tries to build an empire on a single drug. And right now, in 2025, we're watching it happen again with different molecules, different companies, but the exact same sequence. Let me show you the pattern, the 6 stages that destroyed the Methaqualone empire, and why understanding this matters for every prescription bottle in your medicine cabinet right now. Before we go through the stages, you need to understand what Methaqualone actually was and why it seemed like the perfect drug. Methaqualone was a sedative hypnotic, a drug that calms anxiety and induces sleep. It was synthesized in India in 1951 by researchers looking for an anti-malarial compound. It failed as an anti-malarial, but they noticed it had powerful sedative effects. By 1965, a pharmaceutical company had acquired the rights and began marketing it aggressively as a safe alternative to barbiturates. Barbiturates were the dominant sedatives of the 1950s and early 60s, but they had a fatal flaw. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was small. Overdoses were common. Deaths were frequent. The medical community desperately wanted an alternative. Methaqualone seemed to be that alternative. Early studies suggested it was non-addictive, safer than barbiturates, and effective for anxiety and insomnia. The company branded it brilliantly, positioned it as the modern solution, and doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Within 5 years, it became one of the most prescribed sedatives in America. But the company made a critical miscalculation. They believed they could control how the drug was used, who used it, and what happened after it left the pharmacy. They were wrong. And that miscalculation would trigger a sequence that has destroyed every pharmaceutical empire that followed the same path. This is stage 1. Create the perfect drug narrative. Every pharmaceutical empire begins the same way, with a drug that solves a real problem and appears to have minimal downsides. The company positioned Methaqualone as everything barbiturates weren't: safe, non-addictive, effective, modern. They published studies showing low addiction potential. They trained sales representatives to emphasize safety to doctors. They created marketing materials showing happy, well-rested patients. The medical journals ran articles praising the new sedative. Doctors, who had watched patients die from barbiturate overdoses, embraced the alternative. Prescriptions exploded. By 1972, Methaqualone was the 6th most prescribed sedative in the United States. Over 2 billion tablets were being manufactured annually. The company's stock price tripled. Revenue from this single drug exceeded the total revenue of most pharmaceutical companies. This is the foundation of every drug empire: a molecule that works, a narrative that sells, and a medical community that believes. But the narrative was already cracking. Reports were emerging that Methaqualone was more addictive than claimed. Users were taking higher doses than prescribed. Emergency rooms were seeing overdoses. But the company had too much invested. The revenue was too large. The market position was too dominant. So instead of pulling back, they doubled down. They expanded marketing. They pushed for approval in more countries. They fought any suggestion that the drug was dangerous. This is the pattern. The company becomes dependent on the drug's revenue, and that dependency blinds them to the warning signs. Stage 2. Lose control of distribution and use. The company manufactured the drug and sold it to pharmacies. But they couldn't control what happened next. Doctors were prescribing it not just for insomnia, but for anxiety, stress, even mild discomfort. Patients were sharing pills with friends. Some were taking double or triple the recommended dose because tolerance built quickly, and then the recreational market discovered it. By 1970, Methaqualone had a street name and a reputation. It produced euphoria at higher doses. It was being used at parties, in clubs, combined with alcohol for intensified effects. The company had no mechanism to stop this. They didn't control the prescribing. They didn't control the distribution after sale. They didn't control patient behavior. The drug had escaped. Underground manufacturers started producing it. The chemical synthesis wasn't complex. Labs in basements and warehouses began making millions of tablets. These weren't pharmaceutical grade. Dosages were inconsistent. Purity was questionable. Overdoses increased. By 1973, emergency room visits related to Methaqualone had increased 300% in 2 years. Deaths were being reported. The drug that was supposed to be safe was killing people. But here's the critical detail. Most of the deaths and overdoses weren't from the pharmaceutical company's product. They were from street versions, from misuse, from combinations with alcohol. But the public didn't distinguish. The drug itself became associated with danger, and the company's brand was tied to the drug. This is stage 2. The company loses control of its own product, and once control is lost, the narrative collapses. Stage 3. Regulatory pressure builds. By 1973, the federal government was receiving reports from hospitals, coroners, and law enforcement. Methaqualone was showing up in overdose deaths, in arrests, in emergency rooms. The Drug Enforcement Administration began investigating. Medical boards started questioning whether the drug should remain widely available. The company fought back. They argued that the problem wasn't the drug, it was misuse. They pointed out that most overdoses involved street versions, not their product. They emphasized that millions of patients used it safely. They lobbied Congress. They funded studies showing therapeutic benefit. But the momentum was against them. In 1973, Methaqualone was placed under federal control as a Schedule II drug, meaning it had accepted medical use but high potential for abuse. This restricted prescribing. Doctors had to use special prescription forms. Pharmacies had to track inventory more carefully. Prescriptions dropped 40% in 1 year. The company's revenue from the drug fell proportionally, but Schedule II wasn't enough. The recreational use continued. The street market thrived, and the deaths kept coming. By 1978, Methaqualone was involved in thousands of emergency room visits annually. The government moved it to Schedule I in some formulations, meaning no accepted medical use and high abuse potential. This effectively banned it. The company fought this in court. They lost. By 1984, Methaqualone was completely banned in the United States. The drug that had generated billions in revenue was now illegal to manufacture, prescribe, or possess. The empire was over. Stage 4. The company's dependence becomes fatal. Here's what most people don't understand about pharmaceutical empires built on single drugs. The company becomes structurally dependent on that revenue. When Methaqualone was at its peak, it represented over 60% of the company's total revenue. They had built infrastructure around it, manufacturing facilities dedicated to production, sales teams trained to sell it, marketing budgets allocated to promoting it, executive compensation tied to its performance. When the drug was restricted and then banned, the company didn't just lose a product. They lost their entire business model. They tried to pivot. They attempted to develop other sedatives. They acquired smaller drug portfolios. But none of it replaced the revenue. The company's stock collapsed. Within 3 years of the ban, the company was acquired by a larger pharmaceutical firm for a fraction of its peak valuation. The executives who had built the empire were gone. The facilities were repurposed or closed. The brand disappeared. This is stage 4. The dependence on a single drug makes the company fragile, and when that drug is removed, the company collapses. If you're watching this and you're starting to see how pharmaceutical companies engineer dependency, how they lose control of their own products, and how regulatory systems respond, then you're understanding a pattern that's playing out right now with opioids, with stimulants, with every blockbuster drug that gets overprescribed. Subscribe to Economy Time Machine because we're going to track these patterns as they unfold, show you the warning signs before the collapse happens. and help you understand the economic forces that shape the pills in your medicine cabinet. The pattern doesn't stop at stage 4. There are 2 more stages that complete the cycle. Stage 5, the drug becomes culturally toxic. Even after Methaqualone was banned in the United States, it continued to be manufactured in other countries. Some nations didn't ban it until the 1990s. But the cultural association had been set. Methaqualone wasn't a medicine anymore. It was a symbol of excess, of the 1970s party culture, of danger. Movies and television referenced it as a punchline or a cautionary tale. Medical schools taught it as an example of what happens when a drug is overprescribed. The pharmaceutical industry used it as a case study in what not to do. The drug's reputation was so damaged that even in countries where it remained legal, doctors stopped prescribing it. Patients didn't want it. The brand was poison. This is stage 5. The drug becomes culturally toxic, and once that happens, there's no recovery. No rebranding can fix it. No new studies can rehabilitate it. The molecule itself is tainted. Stage 6. The pattern repeats with a new drug. Here's the final stage. The pharmaceutical industry learned nothing. Within a decade of Methaqualone's collapse, another company was building an empire on benzodiazepines. Same pattern. Marketed as safe, prescribed widely. Recreational use emerged. Overdoses increased. Regulatory pressure built. Then opioids. Same pattern. Marketed as non-addictive. Prescribed for everything from surgery to back pain. Addiction epidemic. Regulatory crackdown. Companies collapsed or paid billions in settlements. Now it's stimulants for attention disorders. Same pattern forming. Prescribed to millions. Recreational use spreading. Emergency room visits increasing. The 6-stage pattern repeats because the incentives haven't changed. Pharmaceutical companies make billions from blockbuster drugs. They become dependent on that revenue. They fight to protect it. They lose control. Regulators respond. The empire collapses. And a new company starts the cycle with a different molecule. Let me show you the specific data proving this pattern is active right now. Stimulant prescriptions for attention disorders have increased 400% in the last 15 years. We're in stage 1 and 2. The perfect drug narrative is established. Distribution is expanding beyond original intent. Emergency room visits related to stimulant misuse have increased 200% in the last 5 years. We're entering stage 3. Regulatory pressure is building. The DEA has issued warnings. Medical boards are questioning prescribing practices. Several pharmaceutical companies derive 40 to 50% of revenue from stimulant products. We're in stage 4. Structural dependence is established. The companies are vulnerable. Cultural conversation is shifting. Media coverage is increasing. Lawsuits are being filed. We're approaching stage 5. The drug is becoming culturally toxic. Stage 6 is inevitable. The pattern says within 5 to 10 years, we'll see major restrictions, company collapses, and a new drug empire rising to replace it. This isn't prediction. This is pattern recognition. Now let me show you why the Methaqualone empire had to die. It wasn't just regulatory pressure. It wasn't just overdoses. It was mathematical. The business model was unsustainable. When a pharmaceutical company builds everything on a single drug, they create a ticking clock. The drug has a life cycle. Patent protection expires. Generic competition emerges. Side effects accumulate in the population. Regulatory scrutiny increases. Cultural attitudes shift. The company has maybe 10 to 15 years of dominance. After that, decline is inevitable. The smart pharmaceutical companies diversify. They develop pipelines of drugs. They acquire other companies. They spread risk across multiple products. The Methaqualone company didn't do this. They rode one drug to massive profits and assumed it would last forever. It lasted 12 years from peak to ban. The company that made billions became worthless in less than a decade. This is the lesson. Single drug empires always collapse. The only question is timing. Here's what this means for you right now. Every prescription you fill is part of a pharmaceutical company's revenue model. Some of those companies are diversified and stable. Others are dependent on one or two blockbuster drugs. If you're taking a drug that represents a huge percentage of a company's revenue, you're taking a drug that's vulnerable. Not because it doesn't work, because the company will fight to protect that revenue even when warning signs emerge. They'll downplay side effects. They'll fight restrictions. They'll maximize prescriptions. This is rational behavior for a company dependent on one product. But it's dangerous for patients. The Methaqualone empire died because the company prioritized revenue over safety. They saw the warning signs in the early 1970s. They ignored them. By the time they acknowledged the problem, it was too late. The drug was out of control. The regulatory response was inevitable, and the company was destroyed. This pattern repeats because pharmaceutical economics incentivize short-term profit over long-term sustainability. A company can make more money riding one blockbuster drug for 10 years than developing a diverse portfolio over 30 years. The executives get rich, the shareholders profit, and when the collapse comes, they've already moved on. The patients are left with withdrawn drugs, disrupted treatments, and the realization that the system prioritized profit over their health. 3 times in the last 50 years, major pharmaceutical empires have collapsed following this exact pattern. Methaqualone in the 1980s, opioids in the 2010s, and the next one is forming right now. Each time, the companies claimed they didn't see it coming. Each time, the warning signs were obvious years in advance. Each time, the pattern played out identically. Stage 1, perfect drug narrative. Stage 2, loss of control. Stage 3, regulatory pressure. Stage 4, company dependence becomes fatal. Stage 5, cultural toxicity. Stage 6, pattern repeats. The Methaqualone empire made billions and collapsed in 15 years. The opioid empires made hundreds of billions and are collapsing now through bankruptcies and settlements. The next empire is being built right now, and it will follow the same path, because the incentives haven't changed. The regulatory system is reactive, not proactive, and pharmaceutical companies optimize for quarterly earnings, not decade-long sustainability. If this changed how you see pharmaceutical companies, if you understand now that drug empires are designed to collapse, if you recognize the pattern forming with current blockbuster drugs, then you're seeing what most people miss. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. Companies profit enormously for a decade, then collapse. New companies rise with new drugs. The cycle continues. Subscribe to Economy Time Machine because we're going to track the next collapse as it happens, show you which companies are vulnerable, and help you understand the economic forces that determine which drugs you're prescribed and why. The Methaqualone empire is dead. The molecule is banned in most of the world, but the pattern is alive, and it's building toward the next collapse right now. The timeline says 5 to 10 years. The warning signs are already visible. And when it happens, everyone will act surprised, except those who understood the pattern.